Hi everyone, welcome to the 7th webinar in the AWC3's webinar series about watercourse crossings. My name is Daniel Monaco and I'll be acting as host for your webinar today. So before getting into today's webinar, I just want to give a brief introduction to AWC3 in case that this is the first webinar in the series that you're viewing. So it is a not-for-profit organization whose primary objective is to facilitate information transfer around the issue of watercourse crossings in Alberta and their impact on native fish species. So this is what this webinar series is all about, is sharing information from subject matter experts and trying to get that information out to as many people as possible. Since we have received some questions about this, I just want to let everybody know that this webinar can be used for continuing competency credits for professional associations. It counts as half an hour of credits and has been approved by most of the major professional associations. So if that is something you're hoping to take advantage of, please keep your receipts and your registration confirmation email. And if you have any questions about this, you can email us at info@awccc.ca. So today's webinar is about measuring fish habitat connectivity in freshwater ecosystems. And we have Mark Poesch from the University of Alberta with us today as a presenter. So to give a bit of a background on him, Dr. Mark Poesch is an associate professor at the University of Alberta in the Department of Renewable Resources. Dr. Poesch sits on both the federal and provincial listing bodies for species at risk in Canada and numerous intergovernmental committees and non-governmental groups, including as the outgoing president of the Canadian Aquatic Resources section of the American Fisheries Society, the largest professional group focusing on fish in Canada. Dr. Poesch has been working extensively on issues related to the decline in freshwater biodiversity, including on effects of habitat loss and fragmentation, metal contamination, and invasive species. Dr. Poesch is the 2020 Stevenson Award winner given out by the editors of Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences for young, energetic, and creative researcher at the cutting edge of an aquatic discipline. So before passing things off to him, if anybody has any questions throughout the presentation, you can submit those through the GoToWebinar program. There should be a toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be compiling those questions from the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll go through those once the presentation is done. So the presentation will take about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour of question and answer period. So I would like to ask anybody, if you are submitting questions, please make sure that they remain pertinent to the specific topic being presented today so that our presenter and panelists can answer those to the best of their ability. So without further ado, I'll pass things off to Dr. Poesch.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges and opportunities that I see as far as measuring connectivity in freshwater systems. And as most of you are probably aware, the rate of decline in freshwater fishes has surpassed terrestrial marine species. In the latest report by the World Wildlife Federation, they have found that freshwater fish have a rate of decline much higher than these other taxa. And it's thought that 46% of described native freshwater and diadromous species in North America are considered at risk. Here in Alberta, many iconic species are now listed as species at risk, including very important species such as bull trout, West Slope cutthroat trout, pygmy whitefish, among others. And the rate of extinction that we currently have is thought by ecologist E.O. Wilson to be about 100 to 1,000 times the natural background rate. So understanding not just the mechanisms related to this decline, but how we can go about mitigating it and improve recovery of these species is something that I've spent a lot of time on and is a major concentration of my research group. If we look across threats to Canadians' biodiversity, there's a paper by Al Dextres in Ontario and Nick Mandrak, where they compared various different threats, including habitat alteration, alien or invasive species, the amount of harvest, pollution, the effect of other native species or a catch-all group of other. What they found is that habitat alteration is the leading primary effect for the decline of freshwater fishes. And this is sort of where this talk is concentrated on. in particular the effect of habitat alteration through fragmentation by stream crossings. This leaves species at risk in this precarious position. Because these changes are happening at such a rapid rate, species, as Charles Darwin once said, are left with the ability to have to be responsive to this rapid change in a way, in a time scale that they're not unused to or haven't evolved for. And so they're left with the option of either adapting or dying. And as I spent some time in the province of Alberta looking at the landscape and studying it, what I've noticed is that the issue of habitat connectivity is a major issue related to freshwater fishes. And if we look across publication rates of the concept of habitat connectivity, in general, we see in the past decade or so that there's been a relative increase in the interest of academics and others who have looked at habitat connectivity. And this interest goes across a broad spectrum of different fields, including ecology, environmental sciences, geography, zoology, evolutionary biology, etc. And so we see this broadening interest in the concept of habitat connectivity, but interestingly, we don't see the same effect when we look at habitat connectivity in fresh waters. And this begs the question as to why. If there's such an increase in interest of habitat connectivity, why has that not been seen when we look at it in fresh waters? And for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of these challenges that I see as why this has happened in other areas of freshwater research. And just for timing, I'm going to limit myself to 3 challenges. And the first challenge is really the immensity of measuring habitat connectivity. So when we go into a given area, the problem of fragmentation seems to be beyond our capacity to actually try and solve. And hopefully, when you leave this talk, you won't be left with that same feeling of a challenge. The second one is, how do we measure connectivity, especially when we talk about prioritizing the removal of barriers that really optimize benefit to fish? And I put in parentheses here, and money, because money is not infinite. So we need to consider both simultaneously. And so this concept, I think, has received a lot of traction recently in the sense that many metrics now incorporate life history characteristics of fish into them when they're calculating how to prioritize barrier removal. And the third challenge, which is a really difficult one, is that how do we measure connectivity into the future? Is it that we want connectivity now or for later when we consider things like climate change and the predicted changes that are expected? And that's a difficult, maybe more philosophical question, but one I think that we need to keep in the back of our minds. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus on each one of these challenges. And then towards the end, I'm going to follow up with what I think are some opportunities for us as a society to help address some of these challenges. And so the first challenge is really the immensity of habitat connectivity issues. And this is a great picture here of a rice paddy field in Asia that really demonstrates that humans have drastically altered their landscape. And we see these types of altered landscapes regardless of where you go. I've spent some time in remote places in the Amazon, Mekong, Mackenzie drainages, amongst others, and I can tell you from experience, regardless of how remote it is, the impact of humans is clearly noticed. This is a figure taken from a recent 2019 article from Science by Grill et al. That shows the effect of connectivity issues in fresh waters across the globe. And essentially 50% of rivers have diminished connectivity from various degrees. So half of our rivers are impaired already. When we talk about large rivers, about 63% of the world's longest rivers, over 1,000 kilometers or longer, are no longer free flowing. And this represents roughly 41% of the global river volume. So regardless of where you go, connectivity is an issue. But if you focus in on North America in particular, you can see the amount of impairment that we have as far as connectivity. In the same paper, they tried to look at different indicators that where connectivity was an issue. So the red here indicates fragmentation. So these are when structures no longer allow or impair the movement of fish from downstream to upstream, versus things like water regulation, sediment trapping, consumptive water use, or urbanization. And by far, over 2/3 of the most important indicator is that degree of fragmentation. And this is the scale that I think where we are losing the battle as far as decline in freshwater fish. This very issue of fragmentation from things such as stream crossings. And I've spent time looking at stream crossings issues around the world. This is a picture of a dam on the Moon River in the Mekong Basin. And this is the fish ladder that's meant to maintain connectivity. And as you may see from further up on that fish ladder, it's completely dry, and below that fish ladder, it is also completely dry. And so this attempt to create fish passage, in the case of the Moon River, obviously failed, but the more important aspect is the people that it affected downstream. And so many of these people use the Moon River for sustenance of their diet using fish, and all of these people downstream of this dam were not consulted on any of these fish fragmentation issues. And so connectivity and looking at these potential issues of fragmentation is a worldwide issue. And the effect it has on those downstream communities in maintaining river flow. So in this case here on the Mekong, this is a trap that's put in place to collect fish during the high water season. And so obviously when we regulate rivers to the extent that we see around the globe, the people who rely on them are most dramatically affected. And this happens not just in places like the Mekong, this happens here closer to home. And so I'll talk a bit about a case study where I had a student, Brian Maitland, look at the effect of industrial road crossings on fish community structure near Grand Prairie as far as his master's project. And what Brian wanted to do is compare things like culverts versus bridges versus reference areas in various watersheds in the Grand Prairie area, in the Simonette area. So this is an example of some of the crossing structures that he found there. So as you can see, there are some perch culverts that are found within the system. So just to give you some background on Brian's work, he compared culverts, bridges, and references, and he looked at a balanced design between all three of these. If you're interested, this paper was published in 2016. I'd be happy to pass you a copy. And he compared downstream versus upstream for a bunch of not just fish metrics, but biophysical as well. So Brian spent some time sampling fish. So this is a road crossing. And he looked at things such as turbidity, dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, as well as depth, wetted width, percent pool, riffle run, etc., as far as habitat characteristics were concerned. And what Brian found was really maybe not surprising, but a dramatic effect of some of these crossing structures. And again, this is the scale where I think we're losing the battle on freshwater fishes. So whether we compare density, so number of fish per meter squared, or richness, just the number of species, there was a dramatic decline of both of these metrics in culverts between downstream and upstream, suggesting a fragmentation issue. And this happened, generally speaking, most dramatically in culverts, but you did see it in richness for bridges as well. But culverts were really where we saw the most dramatic effect. So in the gray bars here, those are the estimates of each metric downstream of the crossing structure versus upstream, shown in white. And you can see just a significant difference found in both density and richness of species downstream versus upstream in culverts versus bridges or reference, which were significantly different. And this difference was shown across all the species we looked at. So essentially, when we have a problem crossing structure, like a problem perch culvert, this perch culvert has dramatic effects for every species within the assemblage: slimy sculpin, lake chub, various cyprinids, brook stickleback, red-side shiner, various sucker species, and long-nosed dace, although salmons were a little bit more difficult because their numbers were much more declined. What you see is that these problem stream crossings affect the entire community, regardless so there's no fish that was not affected. And so looking at this challenge, this immensity of problem crossings, not just in Alberta, but around the globe, the next question is, well, how do we solve it? And this is, I think, the next challenge that we face. So how do we solve it? By developing metrics that allow us to optimize the benefits to stream fish. And unlike terrestrial species or birds, where we view habitat connectivity is much more free flowing. So these are examples of movement patterns of a bird species, the oriental honey buzzard on the left in Borneo, and the beluga whale on the right. In these cases, you can see that these animals are not restricted by any issues of fragmentation, and understanding movement patterns is quite simple. In contrast, rivers form these dendritic networks that form stepping stone functions upstream to downstream. That is, the fish are confined by the river network, and any crossing structure within this network will affect the entirety of that network. And so unlike terrestrial species where you may impede movement and animals may be able to move around it, in freshwater fishes they are confined. And so we have this problem of embeddedness, and this embeddedness creates what I refer to as lotic islands. And so these are areas where fragmentation, either through watershed boundaries, inhospitable habitat, or other types of movement barriers, have really stranded species that are unable to reach further downstream or upstream. And so looking at these lotic islands, we've discovered that there are many ways that we could change the way that we prioritize how we remove stream crossings that may benefit freshwater fish communities in general. So from a fish's perspective, this is what a crossing looks like. So we have a river, a tributary of a major river, and roads move into this area that dissect these tributaries. And if we have perch culverts on that landscape, we have now created isolated populations of fish species. So these are these lotic islands, these fish communities that are now stranded in between these problem crossing structures. So not only do these problem crossing structures disrupt longitudinal connectivity, they also alter in-stream habitat through things such as sedimentation. And so there's been talks in the series previously on that. They also increase anglers to these areas, so greater access means more anglers are able to get to those areas, and so it creates an issue of cumulative effects. And the fish that are stranded there are really quite impacted by all of these local issues that tend to occur from these changes from the crossings. And so it tends to be a death from a thousand cuts. And so when we go through a traditional fish passage evaluation criteria that looks something like this, many of the sort of physical habitat items are measured or considered within this structure, but often life history characteristics of fish are not. And so when fish are stranded by these problem culverts, the consideration of how to benefit the fish is not directly included in some of these assessments. And I'll show you maybe an alternative way of doing that. And one of the problems is that there's a litany of different metrics one can use to measure how much connectivity is increased when you remove a problem structure. So here's a dozen or so different metrics that have been used. And essentially, most of these metrics were meant to look at various forms of linear distance increased. So when you remove a problem structure, how much more distance is increased? And again, not the consideration of the life history characteristics of fish. And just for demonstration, I'll show you how we compare two of these dendritic connectivity indices that look at life history. So in this one case, there's stream resident consideration and diadromous fish in the other. And maybe unassuredly, what the result was, so here we have the Simonet watershed. Some of them are model systems that we looked at, various creeks that have problem structures. where we looked at measuring these different indices, and each one of these barriers or these crossing structures have a various score. And regardless of how we measured the score, whether we used the anadromous or diadromous versus the resident fish species, basically various structures ended up being prioritized, which suggests that there is no general metric that one could use. And I think this gives us maybe a false precedent to really say that, well, we could use any one of these. But I don't think that's necessarily the case, because I think there's a lot of different considerations one must consider when looking at prioritizing these problem crossings. So we need to consider not just the length, so not just the linear distance, but how much or what kind of habitat is available, the accessibility to those habitats. So can the fish actually get there? So it's not just how much habitat, what kind is there, can they get there? And is it nice there? So how suitable is the habitat further once you remove that problem crossing? We also should consider whether or not the species is able to get there. So can the species actually get to these areas? But we also must consider money. So we must optimize this in a way that is fiscally responsible. And this seems like a long laundry list of different issues related to life histories of fish as well as money, but there are ways in which we could do this. So I'll show you an example of how we include individual project costs and optimize stream crossings. And for this, we use a measurement called the C metric. The C metric is a normalized stream connectivity measure that accounts for habitat quality, quantity, and accessibility. It will account for variation within species specific dispersal, so whether it's a small stickleback to a large bull trout. And in many cases, it's thought to be superior when you're looking at the effect of removing a crossing within a stream network. Now, recently, in 2013, O'Hanley and others used a budget constrained optimization model where they look at actually constraining this model based on the available money for restoration activities to maximize habitat connectivity of fish. And this is essentially what it looks like. I won't get into too much of the math, but the model actually considers parameters that I think are very important. So this parameter here looks at the proportion of the habitat type present versus the suitability of those habitat types. So various, not just one measure, but various types of habitats that are there. The length of the stream segment, the dispersal ability of the species you're interested in, and the bidirectional passability of barriers between them. So all of those life history characteristics are considered within this model, and O'Hanley and others added on top of that a budget restricted optimization. So considering all of these things and the project cost to remediate it, which crossings would give you the best bang for your buck. So I won't go into the optimization math because it gets a little bit wonky at times, but essentially this is the simplified version of the C metric. We looked at the C metric in the Simonette watershed. So here we went back and looked at those different crossings where there are culverts and bridges. And we looked at two sub-watersheds, Latronelle Creek and Deep Valley Creek. And we looked at this budget optimization framework. And here we have those two model creeks. And we can see that as you add more money, so on the x-axis, we have hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what we see in both cases is that there's sort of this asymptote that occurs. So if we were to spend millions of dollars, it wouldn't necessarily have the same benefit as if you spent, say, $200,000 in the case of Deep Valley Creek. And so when we did this optimization model, we found that there was this asymptotic relationship value that occurred. And in the case of Deep Valley Creek, as little as $200,000 could remediate the most problem culverts and add the most bang for the buck. Latronelle River, on the other hand, seemed to have more of a linear function related to that asymptote. And so there were problem culverts. The first two would definitely improve the river more substantially than the others, but the rest remained sort of a linear function. So this framework looked at not just the cost, but also optimizing the habitat and the suitability of the habitat for the species that were of interest. So finally, the last challenge is how do we measure connectivity into the future? So I've talked about the immensity of the problem and some ideas of how we can go about including life history evaluations in metrics for problem stream crossings, but what is it we're actually attempting to achieve? And so many of you are aware that the effects of climate change are going to change not just air temperature, but water temperature, and dramatically alter extreme events such as flood events. And so how we size things like culverts will become more of an issue as climate change effects continue to occur. We did one study where we looked at a species at risk, the Carmen shiner in sort of central North America, where we predicted where Carmen shiner were to occur. And so this is a bit of a busy slide, but essentially what we wanted to look at was where was thermally suitable habitat into the future. So on the right here, we have the future distribution from 2041 to 2060. And the top one is a sort of a restricted climate model. The one on the bottom is a business as usual model, which means that there's going to be more carbon released. And we looked at not just suitability, but we looked at areas that were going to have future gains versus future losses. And not surprisingly, we found in this species, there was a latitudinal shift from its southern portion, where we were seeing losses into the future, to its northern portion, which begs the question of what should we be doing as far as mitigating effects to species at risk? Should we be managing to where they are now, or should we be managing to the future? And I would say that the effects of global climate change are going to be non-linear, and we see this for many different species, not just Carmen shiner, but Arctic grayling. We've looked at the feeding rate for Arctic grayling to maintain their same bioenergetic rates, and in this case here, you can see that it's not linear. As you go north, the change that we see as far as feeding rates are going to be more dramatic in the north versus the south. And so this poses a problem for as we're mitigating these problem crossings, how are we going to size them appropriately so that it's going to maintain freshwater fish into the future? And I'll give you some ideas in a second. And so just a brief summary. The alterations of habitat are thought to be the leading drivers of species loss in freshwater systems. And this is especially true, in my experience, in the Boreal and foothills region of Alberta. So the issues of hydrologic alterations and problem crossings are a global issue, but we see this close to home as well. And as I've shown in the study from my student Brian Maitland, this clearly affects freshwater fishes, but also affects people that rely on those fish. For each of these challenges, I tried to identify an opportunity that I think is important for us to consider. So when we talk about the immensity of measuring habitat connectivity, I think the scale in which we see this is quite small. These problem culverts are riddled across the landscape. And so mitigating even small scale problems can make a big difference in the long run. And so the saying is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I think the immensity of the problem of problem crossings is the same. How do you solve the issue of problem crossings? One problem crossing at a time. As far as measuring and developing prioritization methods, there's lots of debate around there about how best to do that. What I wanted to demonstrate to you today was that there are metrics that one can use that optimize both the benefit to fish, but do so in a fiscally constrained model. And so this may not, there may not be one universally accepted approach. So maybe the approach that I demonstrate may not be the one that's universally accepted, but maybe optimistically, this can be done. We can incorporate species-specific life histories in a budget-constrained model that demonstrates where the bang for your buck can go. And when we talk about measuring connectivity in the future, we know that climate change is going to be a major driver for species at risk. So I've shown you some examples of Carmen shiner and Arctic grayling. So how do we develop change on the ground? Well, I would say when we're talking about crossing structures, we should think about the future. So when we talk about things like sizing for 1 in 100-year floods, those 1 in 100-year floods are no longer 1 in 100 years. They're 1 in 20 years. And when we're talking about sizing, we should consider that in mind and have anticipation of future issues now so that we're acting proactively as opposed to reactively. So much of this work was done by a dedicated group of graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, field assistants, and lab assistants, and many collaborators. And I just want to acknowledge them, as well as we're grateful to the many funding partners that we have. And I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. Before we move into the question and answer period, just because I don't really see many questions popping up in the window just yet, I'm just going to put up a quick poll to give people about a minute to answer, and that'll give you some time to think of questions as well. So it's just a quick question to ask where are your affiliations, what kind of organization you're affiliated with. It just helps us know who's attending these meetings. All right, well, that was about a minute. So yeah, so it looks like most people are from consulting, which has been the case consistently throughout all of these webinars. So that's great. Thanks everybody for giving that little bit of input. So we'll jump right into the questions. I'll start with this one here. So do you think the current watercourse crossing assessment protocol will help Alberta measure the loss of connectivity and maybe help solve the problem? Should there be changes made to it?
That's okay. That's a good question. I'll try not to get myself into too much hot water. I think the issue that I highlighted in the second challenge of how do you measure connectivity is particularly important to this question. And I think the intent for the watercourse crossing inspection is good. It's intended to look at physical issues related to problem crossings. But I think we also need to consider the recipient community, fish communities that are there. And the example I provided was one way you could do that. So we see the dramatic decline of species such as bull trout, grayling, West Slope cutthroat trout, and it tends to be a death from 1,000 cuts. And so I think what we could improve is incorporating those the species that I guess we deem to be of high value, which is a bit of a subjective statement. But if we agree that species at risk, we are mandated to preserve and protect, then certainly incorporating specific metrics that help mitigate or remediate these problem crossings with those species in mind will be helpful moving forward. So my answer is the intent is good to look at physical issues such as sedimentation, the culvert height, as far as whether it's perch or not. Those are great as far as measures are concerned, but how in a fiscally challenging period that we're in, how do we go with a small amount of money to make the biggest difference? I think the approach to use for that would be to incorporate the recipient communities that we're interested in.
All right, great, thanks. So the next question that we received here is, with your watershed-specific studies, such as the one in the Simonette, is there an opportunity to partner with industry to remediate specific crossings to improve the results from the studies? Or to prove the results there?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was actually the intent of this project, was to use Brian's study to identify problem crossings, go in, mitigate those problem crossings, and come back and see what the benefit was. Yeah, I think the goal is still to do that. I'm hopeful anyways. Brian obviously had 2 years to finish his degree and had to go elsewhere, but I think it would be good for us to demonstrate the success of the approach on the ground. But we haven't yet done that. But I would be happy to work with various industry partners if there is interest to how they could use approaches such as the one I I talked about, it doesn't need to be that one, but at least considering species specific and fiscal constraints within an optimization framework, I think can be done. And I think demonstrating the proof of concept would be really beneficial. Unfortunately, like I said, as a research project, there was an end date for that project, and Brian had to move on to greener pastures, but I certainly would be interested in doing that.
All right, thanks. So the next question is, what was the common reason for changes in richness and general fish numbers? So in those studies that compared upstream to downstream of a crossing, what were the general reasons for that? And he's asking specifically in bridge installations.
Yeah, so there was a smaller effect that we saw in bridge structures. And I think the reason for that was just the nestedness of those bridge structures. As I mentioned, those dendritic networks are not, they're confined within a landscape of other problem crossings. And as best we could, we tried to, have areas that, weren't affected by that. But in a study system such as the Simonet, that's really difficult. So I think the issues with bridge that we saw for bridges were probably related to the nestedness of other crossing structures that were problematic.
All right. So the next question is, was the U of A able to get the complete stream crossing data set for the Berland watershed from the AEP to analyze watershed connectivity?
Ooh, I mean, in this case, we worked with the Foothills Research Institute, and we did have meetings with them. And I think for Brian's work for his particular watersheds, we had the crossings that FRI was able to get to us, and we had to sign some data sharing agreements. At the time, they were the data holders of that. I think some of that has changed in the more recent time period. But yeah, for Brian's particular study area, we were able to do that. It took a bit of work, but we got it.
All right. So for your rating of the crossings that act as a barrier, do you or how would you recommend opening upper reaches to invasive species such as brook trout, while still keeping in mind the native fishes?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So that's sort of this philosophical issue that happens from time to time. How do you prioritize crossings without the sort of negative effect of invasive species? I could just say practically from a modeling perspective, you would just rate areas that had invasive species really negatively as highly unsuitable. So from a modeling perspective, there's some debate about how you go about weighting. How much weight do you put for invasive species? I'm not sure I can give you the answer for that, but practically speaking, the models are you can incorporate a penalty for invasive species, and that will change the prioritization scheme. It doesn't answer the philosophical question, which remains, right? I mean, sometimes barriers are helpful in that they keep species out, which is true to some extent, but that is a debate of what the sort of trade-off in values that you have as far as which species to keep out and how much you don't want them, which I can't answer.
Okay. So we are actually, that's all the questions that we have. So unless anybody has some last minute questions they want to ask, because we do have a little bit of time left. So the plan was to go right until 2 o'clock, so we have about 19 minutes left. Oh, here's a question. So whose role is it to undertake the prioritization? Is it road owners, regulators?
That's a good question. I think there's probably a shared role, to be honest. I think there's probably room for both. I think being open about things like what the cost of doing the mitigation or remediation measures are will certainly help a discussion. And this happens in other places, I should say, like places like Australia. It's the government actually tells tells the people we're spending, I don't know what the actual value is, but let's say $100 million on protecting species at risk. You decide how to best utilize that. And so these optimization frameworks are sort of well developed in other parts of the world, and with the reality of being that there's not infinite amount of resources available. So I think it requires some partnerships to occur, some truthful dialogue about what resources are available, and then you can start parameterizing these models. So I think it's doable. I really do. I feel optimistic about it. I think it requires just good faith by both parties and a realization that we can't, from the regulator, that we can't solve all the issues, and a sort of a realization from industry to open up their problem crosses for, I guess, I don't know what better word, interrogation or potential action.
All right, thanks. So the next question here, what would you see as ideal culvert impediment? I think maybe embedment is what they're asking about for ensuring fish passage.
Culvert embedment, like how far you embed a culvert?
I think that's what the question is. Yeah.
I guess it's related to how to solve the problem of perch culverts. I think it's the sort of the goal of the question, because of the embedment is, I guess, looking at how do we ensure that culverts don't become perched. I don't know if I'm have the engineering background to really answer that question, other to say that I think sizing of culverts need to consider, as I mentioned, that 1 in 100-year floods are no longer 1 in 100 years. It would be nice to say, hey, just do clear span bridges everywhere, but we know that that's not possible. So I think predicting future flood events as being more common, I guess, would be my only practical piece of advice.
Great, thanks. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. In your opinion, how do we get regulatory, science, industry, NGOs, municipality, etc., together to work as one on this issue? It seems as though the work on this issue is very fragmented across many groups in Alberta.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I think identifying a common goal, like a common societal goal, to bring people together, like the loss of important fish species like bull trout, is one way to do it. I mean, a lot of people, I think, regardless, care about things like that, and could be sort of the mechanism for doing it. I teach a class in third year on fish and wildlife management, and we use sort of multi-stakeholder decision making as one of the things we talk about. And what I emphasize there is the importance of sort of trust in the process and building that grassroots support. And I think that that's really fundamentally needed for any type of cross-disciplinary, multi-stakeholder collaboration is sort of trust in the system, which may be broken currently. And yeah, it's grassroots support, which I think you can get grassroots support by finding a commonality amongst all the users.
All right, great, thanks. So that is the end of the question list again. So I'll give another, excuse me, another minute or two to see if anybody has any more questions to ask. If not, we'll wrap things up maybe a little bit early today. All right, I guess we can wrap up. Just to let everybody know, since we are ending a little bit early, if anybody does have more questions they want to ask, feel free to email any questions to info@awccc.ca, and we'll relay those questions along and try to get those answers to you as best we can. Mark Poesch has given his email address, I believe, in the presentation, so if you want to reach out that way, that's also doable. So yeah, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank today's presenter, Dr. Mark Poesch. Thank you to everyone who attended the webinar, and we hope that you will join us for some of our other presentations over the next few weeks. So our next webinar in the series will be taking place this coming Thursday, May 14th, 2020, where we will have Javed Iqbal from Alberta Agriculture and Forestry presenting about the use of terrestrial LiDAR for watercourse crossing management. So if you did enjoy this webinar, I encourage you to look at the other webinars scheduled as part of our series on our GoToWebinar page or on the awccc.ca website, and register for some of those other webinars. So thank you again to Mark for presenting to us today, and I hope to see all of you attend some of our future webinars. Stay safe and have a great day.
Thank you very much, everyone.